In the fall of 1884, a young field ethnographer named Edwin R. Vance sat in a Hopi village on the Arizona Plateau and copied the elders' testimony into his notebook, line by line, by the light of a kerosene lamp. What he recorded was no fairy tale. The elders described an underground world their ancestors had lived in before they climbed to the surface. They fixed its doorway not at some vague horizon, but at one exact point, deep in the Grand Canyon, where a small river meets a greater one, where a sacred spring still rises from the rock. That night, Vance wrote down a single question: who had lived in the world below? If you don't want to miss the kind of record that gets buried for a century and still finds its way back to the surface, take a second to like and subscribe. Vance's testimony was not the work of a man hunting a sensation. It passed through an ordinary scholarly channel and was entered into a society's proceedings, and then it was quietly filed away into the archive, the place where inconvenient things end up. It was rarely cited and more rarely discussed, then shelved under a single label: a curious legend, low priority, not disproven, not debated, simply buried. But the elders had not spoken in vague terms. They said a world lay buried beneath the surface, that a people had lived there, and that it had sheltered the living, while the world above was destroyed. And the place they pointed to was no gesture at the horizon. It was a location you could stand beside, documented on a map. That is exactly why the record was dangerous. To understand why this matters, start with the canyon itself, because the canyon is the part no one can argue away. The Grand Canyon is not simply large, it is a wound in the earth more than 270 miles long, a mile deep in places. It exposes rock so old that standing on its rim you are looking at nearly half the age of the planet, laid bare in horizontal bands. Most visitors see only the rim and the famous overlooks. They never descend into the inner gorge, never reach the hidden side canyons where the oldest marks of habitation survive. The canyon is not one view, it is a labyrinth of thousands of branching gorges, most of them rarely entered, many of them still holding things that were never catalogued or recorded. Folded into the alcoves and the high ledges that ordinary travelers never reach are the buried marks of human beings, stone dwellings sealed into the cliff face, granaries walled into the rock, petroglyphs pecked into the desert varnish. People lived here, worked here, worshipped here, and then they vanished. The Hopi did not invent a bond to this canyon out of nothing. They inherited it. And the place the elders pointed to has a name, and that name is the hinge of the whole tradition. The Hopi call it the Sipapuni, the place of emergence, the opening through which humanity climbed out of the previous world into this one. They do not put it in some unreachable mythic elsewhere. They fix it to a real feature, down in the gorge of the Little Colorado, a short distance above where it joins the main Colorado. It is a great dome of golden mineral, built up over ages by a spring welling out of the earth, a mound of travertine with a pool at its summit, fed from below. To the Hopi, this is not a curiosity of geology. It is the exact threshold between the world below and the world above, and they made pilgrimages to it, gathering sacred salt from the canyon depths along routes their people had walked for generations. The tradition is not abstract. It is anchored to a spot on the map you could stand beside, a spot where the earth still pushes water and mineral up out of the dark. And that raises a question the comfortable version of history would rather not sit with. Why would a people fix the memory of an entire vanished world to one exact opening in the ground? The answer the Hopi gave is stranger and more ordered than the word legend suggests. In their tradition, this is not the first world, it is the fourth. Before this one there were others, earlier worlds, each inhabited, each brought to an end. The first world, in the telling, was destroyed by fire. The second was ended by ice and cold, the land turning over and freezing. The third was drowned, swept away by a great flood. And each time, as the world above was undone, a remnant of the people who had remembered how to live rightly was preserved and carried through to the next world. The route of that survival ran downward, again and again. The people were sheltered below the surface, kept safe inside the earth while destruction passed overhead, then led up and out into the new world when it was ready to receive them. The Sipapuni fits exactly into this frame. It is not simply where one people came up once. It is the doorway at the end of the most recent destruction, the place where the survivors of the drowned Third World climbed into the Fourth. The tradition holds, too, that this Fourth World is not permanent, that it can be undone like the others if the people forget how to live rightly. So the memory of the emergence is also a warning, carried forward on purpose, anchored to a place a person can actually walk to, so it would not fade into vague story. The most striking thing in Vance's record is the precision of it. The elders recounted the 3 destructions in order. Fire had swept the world, ice had turned the land to stone, water had covered everything. This was not the vagueness of a fairy tale, it was a list, a documented account of something that could happen again. And each time, the escape pointed the same way, down into the dark and then back up. And the keepers of that downward route, the ones who sheltered humanity inside the earth, were not the Hopi themselves, they were someone else. That detail surfaces in a second, independent record. In 1905, another field collector working the plateau, with no knowledge of Vance, wrote down the same point of emergence and added something. The ones who lived below had a name, and it is one of the most unusual details in the entire body of Hopi memory. They were the ant people. When the worlds above were destroyed, first by fire and then by ice, it was the ant people who took the remnant of humanity in. They opened their underground dwellings, brought the survivors down out of the catastrophe, and kept them alive in the world beneath the surface. The tradition describes these beings with a peculiar precision. They were industrious, tireless workers who stored food in abundance and shared it through the lean years. They went hungry themselves, pulling in their own wastes so the people they sheltered could eat, which is why, in the telling, the ant has such a slender waist to this day. They were builders of underground chambers, keepers of the stores. In some tellings they also taught the survivors how to plant, how to store, how to endure. So when the people finally climbed into the new world, they did not arrive helpless. They carried the skills of survival with them. Strip away the name, and what remains is documented plainly. An account of a sheltering people who kept a habitable space underground through more than one global catastrophe. There is a small, strange detail in the collector's note. The elders described these keepers not as enemies, and not as gods, but as neighbors, an orderly, provident, generous people. To remember them was to remember that humanity did not pass through its darkest passage alone. 2 independent collectors, different decades, the same point of emergence, the same people sheltering below. To call that coincidence is to expect 2 separate records to make the identical mistake, 2 notebooks, 2 decades apart, one buried world. So is there anything in the physical world of the canyon that a tradition like this could be built on? There is, and it is not subtle. Here, a third witness enters, a silent one. The Hopi did not arrive on an empty plateau and dream up a populated underworld from nothing. They arrived in a land already saturated with the works of people who had come before, and they knew it. Across the canyon country and the high desert beyond it stand the ruins of the ancestral Puebloan peoples. Cliff dwellings are wedged into sheer rock faces. Whole villages sit built into alcoves hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. Sealed granaries wait where no easy path leads, beside towers and kivas and walls that have stood through centuries of wind. Some of these works sit in places so hard to reach that simply getting to them is a feat, let alone building and living there. These people did exactly what the Hopi tradition describes a people doing. They lived in the rock, stored against hard times, worked the inaccessible canyon, and then, in their own time, they left. The kivas themselves, round ceremonial chambers half sunk into the ground, entered from above through an opening in the roof, carry at their center a small hole in the floor. The Hopi call it the sipapu, a deliberate symbol of the emergence place, the doorway from the world below. The memory of coming up out of the earth is not a loose story floating free of the landscape. It is built into the architecture, and the physical and the remembered point at the same thing. Now a witness of an entirely different kind appears, and this one cannot be blamed on the tradition, because it came from somewhere else entirely. Look at a detailed map of the Grand Canyon, and something strange surfaces. Scattered through the canyon, rising from its floor as isolated peaks and buttes, are formations that carry the names of the temples and gods of the ancient Old World. There is a temple of Isis and a temple of Osiris. There is a Shiva temple, a Brahma temple, a Vishnu temple, a temple of Zoroaster. There is a Cheops pyramid. These are not folklore. They are official names placed on the formations by surveyors and mapmakers in the late 1800s and carried on government maps ever since. A geologist of the era, struck by the cathedral grandeur of the inner canyon peaks, reached past his own world entirely and named them for the sacred architecture of Egypt and India and Persia. These named peaks are not casual landmarks either. Many are isolated summits rising thousands of feet from the canyon floor, cut off on every side, so difficult to reach that some were not climbed by any recorded expedition until well into the 20th century. You can call it romantic fancy, but it is at least worth noticing. When educated observers stood at the rim and looked into that canyon, the thing they reached for was not the language of empty wilderness, it was the language of temples, of a built and sacred place. The canyon pulled the same word out of a Victorian surveyor that it had held for the Hopi all along. Consider what that means. This geologist knew nothing of the Hopi tradition and had almost certainly never heard the name Sipapuni, and yet, standing before the same rock, his hand reached for the same vocabulary: temple, pyramid, god. Zoroaster Temple, at the north end of the canyon, rises to nearly 7,000 feet, and beside its neighbors, the Brahma and Deva summits, it stands like an archipelago of temples cut off from the main gorge, islands of rock, each crowned with the name of a foreign god, stranded in the middle of the canyon. Around a threshold one people held sacred. A man from another culture had scattered a pantheon, without ever knowing he had done it. And the most recent witness comes from living memory. In 1936, a park ranger working near the confluence of the Little Colorado logged a sealed alcove in the canyon wall, a section that rang hollow behind it, unlike the rock around it. The ranger recorded that the stones blocking the mouth of the alcove did not look natural, too ordered, too deliberately placed. He threw a stone inside, and the echo lasted longer than solid rock should allow. He requested a verification team, and the request was denied on grounds of safety. The note never reached the final park report, and survives only in the ranger's personal notebook. 5 sources, from different decades and different professions, none of them aware of the others, none having read the rest, and every one of them points to the same place, that single spot deep in the canyon, the doorway to the world below. They converge on that one threshold far too often to be chance. No official link was ever drawn between them. No record connects the 5. That absence is the point. Now hold the hard part honestly, because this is where the story has to resist the temptation to prove too much. A literal city of ant-shaped beings living in caverns beneath the Grand Canyon is not something the archaeology supports, and pretending otherwise is the kind of overreach that lets the whole subject be waved away. What the evidence supports is narrower, and in its way more interesting. It supports a people with a deep memory of catastrophe, of fire, of cold, of a great flood, preserved in oral testimony across a span of time that written cultures struggle to match. And here the pattern broadens, because the same shape of story, destruction from above, shelter below, emergence afterward, recurs across so many separate peoples, each unaware of the others. Cultures with no known contact, separated by oceans, preserved flood accounts and saved remnant accounts, so similar in shape that the resemblance has puzzled serious scholars for more than a century. Either every people independently invented the same catastrophe out of the same fears, or there is something older underneath the pattern, carried forward by each tradition in its own language. The drowned world and the saved remnant appear again and again, on separate continents. On the clay tablets of Mesopotamia there is a flood, and a handful of people who ride out the water. On the North American plateau, in the languages of peoples living hundreds of miles apart, there are recorded accounts of climbing up from beneath the surface. In separate hemispheres, peoples who never met preserved the same 3 steps: destruction, shelter below, then emergence, each in their own words. A story is invented once, But when the skeleton of that same story turns up in dozens of cultures that never touched, it stops behaving like invention and starts behaving like inheritance. One people forgets, another remembers. The shape survives. The Hopi Sipapuni is only one node in that far larger pattern, but the most precisely anchored one, because it is fixed to a point you can put your finger on a single map. And the more places a pattern repeats independently, the weaker the explanation that each one made it up alone. The honest position is not that the tradition is literal history, nor that it is empty invention. It is that the memory has been compressed, encoded, carried forward, and that we have been too quick to assume there is nothing real underneath it. And this is exactly where the story stops being easy to dismiss. What happened when Vance's record surfaced? It passed through an ordinary scholarly channel and entered a society's proceedings, and then it was silenced. The record was not burned and it was not banned. Something far more effective was done to it. It was filed into the archive under a single label, a curious legend, low priority, and the file was never opened again. That is what the label does. It closes the file without reading it. The surveyor's request to descend into the inner gorge was denied. The ranger's request to verify the sealed alcove was denied on grounds of safety. And access to the inner canyon, to the Little Colorado threshold, to those isolated summits that carry the name Temple, remains restricted to this day. You can trace these records in the collections of the Smithsonian, in the files of the National Park Service, on the shelves of the State Archive. But the field notes themselves have vanished. The survey that confirmed the alignment, the reason the team was turned back, left out of the final reports. No photograph survives, no follow-up survey, no trace. The mechanism is the same every time. A field note comes in, it is given a catalogue number, and it drops into the box marked unclassified or low priority, and that box stays shut until there is no longer any reason to open it. Nobody burns anything, nobody has to lie. The record is simply placed on the right shelf, and the shelf is high enough. Ask for those records today under a FOIA request, and the answer that comes back is often the same: no responsive document located or withheld, and a document missing from the record does not mean it was never placed there. More often, it means it was taken out. The question fed from the very first minute reaches its peak right here. A people pin the memory of an entire lost world to one spring. 5 sources, none aware of the others, converge on the same threshold, and official history files all of it away under a single word, myth, and closes the case. Calling it a legend is not the same as explaining it. It is a polite way of closing the file without reading it. And notice what conceding the obvious does and does not settle. There may be no caverns full of ant-shaped beings waiting beneath the rim. Concede it. It still does not explain why a desert people fixed an entire vanished world to one exact spring in one exact gorge. Nor does it explain why their account of shelter below and emergence after matches almost beat for beat the deepest memories of peoples who never met them. The elders never claimed to be writing a chronicle. They insisted on something harder to dismiss, that there was a world before this one, that the earth itself was its refuge, and that the way out of it is a real place you can still walk to. The Grand Canyon is still there, and so is the place they pointed to. You can find the gorge of the Little Colorado on a map. The golden spring still rises from the canyon floor, the cliff dwellings still cling to the rock, the granaries still wait sealed in the stone, the petroglyphs still hold their unread marks. And at the center of every old kiva floor, the small hole still opens toward the world below. The route the Hopi walked for sacred salt still descends into the canyon depths. A hiker today can follow the same path, stand beside the same travertine dome, and put a hand into water still rising warm from underneath. The threshold where the surveyor was turned back, the alcove where the ranger threw his stone, the summits where the geologists scattered the names of gods, they are all still there, all still behind restricted access. The Hopi stood at the rim of all of this and remembered the emergence. They remembered that they were not the first, that the land had held others, that the earth itself had been a refuge when the surface could not be lived on. They carried that memory forward longer than most nations have existed, until, in the 1800s, someone wrote it down and filed it away. And they never filled the absence with a comfortable ending, because there wasn't one. The only question left is the one the elders left standing at the rim. What happened down in the world below? And how long can a thing be remembered this precisely, by this many people, with nothing real underneath it at all?